This is the panel on water quality coming up, and our panelists include, and I guess they'll be presented in this order. Peter Bauer, who's Executive Director of Protect the Adirondacks, and he's going to focus on stormwater runoff, and also mention some new data on development trends for the Adirondack Park. Chris Navitsky will follow him. Chris is the Lake George Waterkeeper and an engineer, and he's going to talk about that same issue, and I think maybe mention something about on-site sewage. At any rate, he'll be followed by Eileen O'Connor, who's Director of Environmental Health for Cayuga County, and Eileen's going to concentrate on Cayuga's model ordinance regulating septic systems. They're way ahead, it appears, of the rest of New York State, which is, and New York State is way behind on this matter. And then Julie Reagan has come all the way from Lake Tahoe. She's the External Affairs Chief for the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. And she's going to talk about efforts there to restore Lake Tahoe's legendary water quality. This session will be moderated by Brian Mann, Adirondack Bureau Chief for North Country Public Radio, and by our own Phil Brown, who's editor of the Adirondack Explorer. They'll be moderating the question and answer session, which will start later in the morning. So Peter Bauer will kick off the discussion on water quality and what we can do to maintain it and make it better in the Adirondacks. Peter.
You turned it on? All right, thank you. Peter Bauer with Protect the Adirondacks. Good morning. There's lots of chairs up here for anybody standing in the back. This whole side. I don't want to blind anybody with a pointer. Okay, I'm going to whip through about 13 slides, setting the stage for water quality issues in the park, framing the discussion about where we are now with water quality. So, there's really 6 takeaway things for folks to understand from this, but just a couple real quick. Water in the park, as Phil talked about earlier, water is a big part of what the Adirondacks is all about. It's a big part of what the Adirondacks is all about from a quality of life standpoint. It's also the way in which a lot of people engage in the park. For a lot of people, it's not a section of mountain, it's not a forest, it's a lake or a pond that is their sweet spot. It is the place that they feel most passionate about. Water is also a big deal if you're in local government because the tax revenues that come off of shoreline properties, many of you in this room know about, drive and support school districts and local government budgets along with the Forest Preserve. So water is really one of the big resources in the park, and the resources we'll talk about that does not receive the attention that a lot of our forests and mountain resources have. Okay, just briefly, Protect the Adirondacks. We've been in the water quality business for a number of years. We manage the Adirondack Lake Assessment Program in partnership with Paul Smith College. So we have been engaged in water issues with volunteers and lake associations and scores of lakes across the park, as you can see from this map. We've been involved in water quality issues for in a pretty deep way for a number of years. Okay, so one of the first things, the first 6 things to really understand, watershed. Amazing how many folks don't fully appreciate watershed, but watershed is important because everything in the watershed ends up in the lake. This is a graphic of Lake George. Water flowing on Tongue Mountain, it's going to end up in the lake, and that's important. Everything runs downhill. Think of a watershed like a bowl with a lake at the bottom, and everything that comes down the sides ends up in the lake. So it's important to understand that because to understand stormwater, you have to understand watershed. All right. The second thing is that, and Phil talked about this a little bit, The protection of open space has been critical to water quality in the park. Really, what the state has done of most importance for our major lakes and ponds in the park is protecting the watershed. This is Struan Lake, 199,000 acre watershed around Struan Lake, but you can see, the vast amount of wilderness and wild forest lands in that watershed, and conservation easement lands as well. 3/4 of the Struan Lake watershed, the total land area in the watershed, is intact, permanently protected forest lands. That's huge when you look into watersheds, because that's less land that can contribute negative inputs to a water body. You can see the amount of development before the APA, 1,800 houses in this watershed. Since the APA Act, another 1,100 have been built. I didn't do the math, but a fair chunk of the land that is not protected in forest preserve or conservation easement is in rural use or resource management. But, a very big part of the watershed has been protected, so that's important. When you hear about, from some who oppose land acquisition, that, we're not protecting natural resources, we're not, really protecting the long-term interests of communities, I would argue that this is a huge investment in protecting the most economically important natural resource in the park, which is our water quality. And nothing has done it better than the protection of forest lands, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, the second thing to understand, stormwater. Stormwater is the biggest threat to water quality in the park. Stormwater is a big issue. If you don't think about stormwater, hopefully today, every time it rains for the rest of your life, you're going to think about the rain differently. It's not just beautiful on the roof, it's not just great to look at, but the rain is going to hit the ground, it's going to run across parking lots, run over rooftops, run across yards, flow into streams, and as it does, it picks up all sorts of phosphorus and nitrogen, it picks up all sorts of pollutants and contaminants, and it creates stormwater. And this is a good graphic from the Do-It-Yourself Water Quality book. Chris Navitsky brought in that the fund and the Waterkeeper put out. Terrific resource, but it shows how stormwater moves across the surface, and as stormwater does move across the surface, it picks up all sorts of contaminants. So, stormwater, the biggest threat to the park. As we change land, we generate more stormwater. More intensive land uses generate more stormwater. This is another graphic from Do-Yourself Water Quality. An intact forest system produces very little stormwater. Most of the rain that falls, it can filter into the ground, it can evaporate into the air. But as we change land uses, we harden surfaces, we build buildings, we build roads, we build parking lots, we're generating much more stormwater that goes into a lake and does, over time, contribute to negative water quality trends. And we're seeing that in major water bodies across the park, a slow, steady decline in water quality. So, stormwater is a big issue for the lakes and ponds of the Adirondacks. These are very typical lake shores. We've got Bolton on the left. We've got a part of the Fulton chain on the right. Roads heading straight down to the lake. Yards heading straight down to the water bodies. These are perfect conduits. You couldn't have designed systems to get material down to the lake quicker and carry more phosphorus and contaminants that we have in a lot of typical shoreline development around the Adirondacks. Straight slides for nutrients into a water body. So, this is also where a lot of the development that we see in the park is managed. This is part of the APA Land Use and Development Plan map. And as you can see, some of the areas that have the highest density, as Keith talked about, hamlet or moderate intensity, also happen to be the areas that are on lake shores. Struan Lake, Loon Lake, Friends Lake, parts of Lake George, Brant Lake. surrounded by moderate intensity, which is 1.5 acres, or hamlet, which there's no zoning for. So the areas under the Adirondack Park Agency's Land Use and Development Plan that have the highest development density levels are the areas right on our lake shores. And it's those near shore areas that are going to be contributing the highest volumes of stormwater to a lake. So the agency act has done some things with resource management and rural use to limit development to the backcountry, or as far as limiting the total amount. But in some of our ecologically most fragile areas and economically most important areas, the water quality of lakes and lake shores, the agency act actually channels development onto lake shores. So that's a major issue because, as we'll see shortly, the agency act is very weak when it comes to stormwater management. The words stormwater don't exist in the APA Act or regulation. The Agency Act has some cutting restrictions for shoreline management, but it doesn't have a stormwater management plan. It doesn't require applicants to get a stormwater management plan. So it doesn't deal with the biggest long-term issue we have for the water quality of the Adirondacks, which is stormwater management. And this is the tragedy. Okay, where are we today with development real quick? You can see from the right-hand side, 93,000 houses across the park today. When the RCPA did a report in 2001, there were 83,000 houses. We said that another 10,000 houses will come in the next decade. It took 12 years. They arrived. The last 12 years, another 10,000 buildings, principally homes, have been built in the park. Right when in 1973, when the land use plan started, 56,000 houses. Now, more than half of those buildings are in the areas that are the near shore areas for lake shores. They are in hamlet, and they are in moderate intensity areas. The areas that produce the most stormwater are the areas in the park that are most heavily developed. And it's really, while I showed you Spoon Lake before with this big watershed, even though most of that watershed is protected, we can do a lot of damage to an aquatic system from just a small area of land. Water quality in Lake George is deteriorating. 95% of the Lake George watershed is still a natural forest area. It's still intact forest, but just the development on 5% is causing long-term negative water quality trends on Lake George. That's a story you're seeing across the park. We have 150,000 acres of hamlet and moderate intensity with about 55, 60,000 buildings. What's happening there is causing water quality issues across the park for most of the major water bodies. All right, I like to talk about salt for two reasons. One, salt is not produced locally. All the salt in the Adirondacks is brought in. Also, nothing uses salt. So salt builds up in a lake or a pond over time. And this is a study that the Adirondack Watersheds Institute did, in part using ALAP data. But you can see areas around the park where there are hot spots. We have 20 parts per million or more of chloride concentrations that have built up over time. This is the Lake George graphic. Many of you have seen that. Chloride levels, salt levels have built up in Lake George over time. This is important because stormwater just doesn't pick up salt. It also picks up contaminants and phosphorus as it moves across the landscape. This shows how much material is getting to our lakes and ponds. The problem is the lakes and ponds will use up phosphorus. If they get more phosphorus, they'll grow more plants. They'll grow more phytoplankton. It'll start a chain reaction that makes the lake more productive. The salt line tells us how much material is getting to the lake. Just that the lake doesn't process salt, it just builds up over time. But a lake will process all of those nutrients. It's like, when you fertilize your lawn with phosphorus, you can fertilize a lake too. And the result is the same. It grows a lot more material, so it becomes much more productive. And it changes water quality over time. And that's the issue that we're facing in the Adirondacks. This just talks about some water quality clarity levels in the park. You can see in meters, Lake Flower, very different lake than Lake Placid as far as the amount of development, as far as the inputs. Lake Flower sort of gets it from all sides. It's a very urbanized lake in Saranac Lake. The water quality, because there's much more material in the water, there's much more phytoplankton and zooplankton, there's a lot more algae in the water, its clarity levels are a lot less. Clarity is a good indication for overall water quality health. What I don't have on Lake George is the fact that there are real differences between the south end of the lake as far as water quality and the north end of the lake, because the south end of the lake has much more development than the north end of the lake. Okay. So, we have much more productive lakes across the park, largely driven by stormwater pollution, largely driven by intensive development on the areas that are right on the lake shores, the moderate intensity, and the hamlet areas across the park. So, here we are, 2012. The APA doesn't have the tools to manage the biggest threat to water quality, which is stormwater. We're now in the era of climate change. Climate change makes everything worse. Climate change amplifies all of our past mistakes. And you name the issue, climate change makes it worse. So, today, we're getting 30% more rainfall annually than we were 50 years ago. More rain is more stormwater. Not only are we getting more rain, but we're getting more intense and frequent storms. The frequency of intense storms of an inch or more, 2 inches or more in 24 hours is growing. What that does is that produces even more stormwater. So, the warming trends that we see, mostly in the winter, summer has largely been a very small warming trend in the non-winter months, but in the heart of winter we're seeing the biggest changes in temperature. What that means is we're getting less snowfall, but it also means we're getting more rain in the winter. Rain in the winter, at times passing over snowless ground is like, rain hitting concrete. The ground's frozen. The ground's frozen. I'm just about done. The ground is frozen, so it means more stormwater even in winter months. It used to be that there was a break from stormwater in winter months compared to summer months, but we're seeing more stormwater. What all of this means is that our water temperatures have also expanded across the park. Our lakes now have longer growing seasons. The time in which the thermocline sets up, the time that water quality, or the lake water temperatures are high enough to grow phytoplankton, zooplankton, plants, and algae, it starts sooner, it ends later. So our lakes are now able to be more productive because of this growing season at a time when they're getting the highest point ever as far as stormwater pollution. So at a time that we're dumping more pollutants and nutrients into a lake, the lakes are able to do even more with it and grow more things because our climate is changing. Okay, last slide. Where we are with the Park Agency Act and stormwater. The Agency Act does need to be updated. The state of New York needs to get in the stormwater business for the Adirondacks. Right now, we manage stormwater around Lake George. We don't manage stormwater in the rest of the Adirondacks, but we manage stormwater around Lake George. We've been managing stormwater around Lake George for a long time, and it hasn't slowed development on Lake George. The issue is not development, the issue is pollution. Because the Lake George Park Commission has a stormwater ordinance for the entire Lake George watershed, shows that the state of New York is interested in stormwater management around Lake George. We need to extend that clearly across the park. The town of Queensbury, when Dan Schneck was there, I believe Dan signed the zoning law, they've got the best shoreline zoning district in the park, if not one of the best in the state. They take seriously things like shoreline buffers. The APA says you can cut 30% of your shoreline every year. In Queensbury, they say you have to have a buffer. In Queensbury, they say you have to have a buffer of a certain thickness. It has to have trees and plants and shrubs. In Queensbury, you can't put a little house on a little lot. The size of your house is dictated by the size of your lot so that there's enough area to be able to treat stormwater effectively. You can't use fertilizers and pesticides under the Queensbury ordinance, something we need to look at across the park. So, we've got good models through the Lake George Park Commission. There's problems with what the Park Commission has done. Some of us think it could be stronger, but it's still far superior to what we have across the park. And the Queensberry Ordinance shows what can be done locally in the town of Queensberry. The big issue here is that it's very difficult to get back high water quality once you lose it. It's a hugely expensive effort. It's an effort that takes a lot of real difficult work to restore an ecosystem. We have a lot of stable water bodies. We have water bodies that are at the beginning of have very mild downward trends. Now is the time to act if we're going to protect our most important economic asset in the park, which is water. So now is the time to really get serious about it. And the agency clearly has a role because they're not in the game right now. Thank you.
My gosh, we continue right on time. I had a thought, Peter, for a theme song. It could be every time it rains, pollutants from uplands. It's a thought, work on it. It's great to hear that we have some good models that can be picked up elsewhere, models in the Adirondacks. Our next speaker is Chris Navitsky, Lake George Waterkeeper, and he will, I'm sure, continue to talk in the same kind of vein that Peter's been talking about, what we're going to do about Lake George and every other lake in the Adirondacks.
Good morning. My talk will be on how to improve development. And I feel that I am qualified for that. I've been working on permitting and development for 27 years now. First 16 years I worked as in private consulting as an engineer, worked for developers and permitting, and then also worked for municipalities on how to enforce the existing rules and regulation. And for the past 11 years, I've worked as the Lake George Waterkeeper to advocate for water quality protection and how we can do better. So I work for the Fund for Lake George, and as the Lake George Waterkeeper, we are part of the Waterkeeper Alliance, which are over 200 waterkeepers nationally and internationally that advocate for water quality protection. So problems encountered with development. We'll talk about stormwater, and Peter set up this quite well. The problem, we all can see the problem with stormwater, that picture on the left side. You can see the pollution that comes off. A big problem with stormwater nowadays is that as water runs off, it doesn't recharge our grounds, our groundwater. And we can see the impacts that will have on our base flows, on our streams, and we can see the diminishing value that our streams will also have as far as groundwater recharge. We talk about what can the impacts, we see the clear impacts of pollution, but what can the other impacts be? Study done down in the Chesapeake watershed said that as nutrients enter our water bodies, down there it's an estuary, nitrogen is the pollutant of concern, the nutrient of concern. 1 part per million increase affects property values by $16,000. So as we have higher nutrients going into our water bodies, that does affect more than just our water quality and our aesthetics. It also has property values. Disturbance. Disturbance has a great impact on our water quality. Disturbance, the first thing you do is you go in, you remove soils. Soils are nature's sponges, and if you leave here with plenty of things, but I want you to remember that soils are very important. Absorb water, hold water. They also have the biological components and the chemical components that help treat stormwater. We remove trees. It's very important for the interception of runoff, of rainfall, evapotranspiration, and the roots. Very important to get the water in the ground. When we replace trees with roots that are 3 feet deep with grasses with roots that are 2 inches deep, you can start seeing the impact. So disturbance has a great impact. And then planning, the cumulative impacts. A lot of times, agencies and review boards look at projects individually. And I've seen in Lake George over the last 12 years, individual development in a bay is quite different when you look at it cumulatively than when you just look at it as parcel by parcel. So we need to have that cumulative view, and we need to know what is going to be happening long term. We also need to stay away from our important resources, not just the shorelines, the steep slopes, the wetlands, and the other important aspects. Now, I may disappoint some here, but I'm not going to be talking about septic systems. We'll have that covered by the professionals here. So, where do we see gaps in existing development and regulations, and particularly looking at the APA? As Peter said, stormwater is not mentioned once in the APA Act, not in the rules and regulations. Runoff mentioned once in the APA Act, and Keith showed that earlier in section 805. So runoff is mentioned once in the APA Act. Disturbance not mentioned once, clearing not mentioned once. So 40 years ago, stormwater was not a buzzword as it is right now. So I think that leads you to think that it's time to take a look at that. We do need to take that information that we've gathered since the Clean Water Act came in place in 1972, and we need to revisit that and take a look at our regulations. So, where are the gaps in stormwater? We already said we don't even mention it, but the APA relies a lot on the New York State DEC manual. And DEC really only provides permits and for developments over 1 acre. So therefore, you can see a lot of development falls underneath the radar screen. APA staff does follow the manual and take a look at developments, but there are problems with that. You can see up here on the left, red button. You can see the stormwater on the left side. A lot of the stormwater management in the DEC manual focuses on ponds. As Peter said, in the North Country, what happens to ponds? They freeze. So now, as ponds build up, this is a picture taken in mid-January of a pond in the town of Hague. By March, that pipe was covered with ice. So any rainfall that fell went right out of the pond, and there was no stormwater management on that. So again, we did a study in the past 7 years. There are now 40% of the rain event, or the precipitation events in the wintertime between December and March are now rain and not snow. So you can see that we need to take a look at how stormwater regulations are applied. Disturbance, we need to take a look at the natural resource areas, and we need also to take a look at the limits of disturbance. How can we bring this into the equation and try to limit the clearing and the disturbance of those important aspects that really reduce our stormwater runoff and provide the water quality? And planning, again, what are the requirements for submissions? I know locally around the Lake George watershed, there's 5 the municipalities actually have their locally approved plans by the APA. They have requirements for submission of clearing plans, vegetation plans, grading plans. A lot of times those aren't even submitted and reviewed by the various agencies. So again, we need to have people submit plans and provide all the information. We also need to build to the land. You can take a look at this picture on the right side. Again, homes being cut into the hillside where you have 20-foot cuts to accommodate a home. You take away all the good soils, you take away all the vegetation, and it results in more runoff. So we need to take that approach to build to the land. So how can there be improvement? We're going to talk about stormwater management and those aspects. We're going to talk about low-impact development, educational tools, and we're going to talk about ordinances. And this can be done, and it can be done in a manner that allows development to proceed, and it's done in a manner that does not restrict people's rights to development. It's being done all around the area and all around the country, and it is not restricting what people can do, and it actually is benefiting land property values. So here, you can also take a look at the picture on the right side. That's a development in Lake George, in the town of Queensbury. Not any grass was used on this property. Now, I don't know a lot of people around around the park. A lot of questions we hear about geese impact. How can we control geese? Take a look at that property on the right. There's not a lot of grass there. That is one way that we can really take low-impact development and address the other measures that you really don't think will benefit you in the long term. So we talked about the stormwater management regulations. Peter introduced it, but here we have Lake George, which is a park within a park, and probably some of the most forward-thinking stormwater management that's ever been applied. And it's really based on volume and not rate control. And I'll take a step back into my engineering geekdom here. Now you can either rate stormwater on flow rates, which means before development you have a small amount of water, and then after development you'll have a much larger flow rate of water going off a site. And everyone's mindset is to take that flow rate after and restrict it to what there was before. And that is real old school thinking. What you want to do is imagine stormwater as a box, and before development you have a smaller box with all the volume that comes off during an entire storm. After you have a bigger box. What your goal is to reduce what comes off after and make it that smaller box. So what are you going to do with all that extra stormwater? What you need to do is promote infiltration. You need to get it back in the ground, and that is really the basis of low-impact development. You have to encourage water to get back into the ground, and that is the way that we reduce our nutrients running off. That is the way we increase our recharge, and we mimic the natural conditions. On the left side, you see a picture of an infiltration basin. It's not very pretty, but it's very effective at reducing stormwater. And as we've learned more about stormwater management and treatment, we start throwing plants in there and mulches and make it a rain garden. It is much more effective. On the right side, you see how they capture roof runoff and pipe it into the ground. So again, we're taking our impervious cover and we're putting it right into the ground, and we're reducing what runs off of the site. Now the local ordinance, the ordinances in Lake George have also been, they follow the pattern of the APA where local towns can adopt those model ordinances and enforce them themselves. And sometimes that's where we start seeing the disconnect on an advocacy standpoint and how those are applied across municipalities. But another great thing about the Lake George ordinances is that they take a look at retrofitting existing properties. So when properties come in for redevelopment, the ordinance says that you have to take a look at the existing impervious cover, and you must, at a minimum, provide a ½ inch of infiltration for those existing areas. So that way we're getting back to the retrofitting of existing areas, and I think that is very important. Low impact development. This is what some people call it green infrastructure. It is referenced in the new DEC stormwater manual. It's not required, unfortunately. We've had some comments back and forth with DEC, and we obviously advocate for the implementation of low impact development, and we always get the response from DEC. The word is not shall, it is should, and they should take a look at it. We think it should be shall, and that's where we think that regulation should be implemented. So how do we do that? Really, 4 measures: conserve natural resources. We're talking about buffers, we're talking about steep slope areas, we're talking about wetlands, and very important, the soils. Again, nature's sponges. A lot of times people see the nice level area, well, that's where I'm going to build. No, that's where the good soils are. That's where you want to put your stormwater, that's where you may want to put your septic system, and not build in that most advantageous area. So take a look at your site planning. You want to minimize your impacts. We need to minimize your clearing, minimize your grading, minimizing your alteration of the existing soils. Maintain natural drainage patterns. We want to make water work as it goes through a site. When we go in, what do you want to, a lot of times we want to smooth grade a site, take out those humps and hollows where water can naturally pond and soak into the ground. and we want those nice smooth lawns. No, we want to change that mindset. We want to make water work as it goes through the site. Don't fill in those little drainage swales where the natural water patterns go, because we start filling those in, and then all of a sudden downstream they start to become washouts because we are allowing water to flow up quicker. And we also want to reduce our impervious cover. The picture on the left side, out in the middle, there's actually a building being constructed with a green roof. So again, green roof, reducing your impervious cover, that's a very good aspect. And then on the right side is actually a picture of our office of Uncle Lake George, where we retrofit our property to put a strip of pervious pavement. Basically, and I got this criticism a lot. They say, Chris, you're out here commenting on everyone else. Did you ever look at your own office? Basically, it was 100% impervious. So we went in and retrofitted our office and put in a pervious pavement strip, so wherever water falls on that, if it makes it down, it falls into the pervious pavement strip. So again, low impact development measures. Education tools. Again, we talked about the do-it-yourself water quality book. That's what we put out. And this is a tool that actually is used and referenced by some of the local planning boards. They will tell applicants, we would like you to take a look at your development and follow this pattern. We provide information on rain gardens, on shoreline buffers, a 4-tiered shoreline buffer of trees, shrubs, perennials, and the important aspect of duff. It's a big scientific term, but that is the ground cover. That's important to allow water to get in. Also have your biological components going on to help treat stormwater. And also talk about native plantings. So again, we also have a section in this back where all the information in the book is supported by research that we did, and to show that the science backs up what is put in that book. And then we're talking again about the ordinances. We talked about the town of Queensbury. It does work. The other interesting aspect in the town of Queensbury is steep slopes. They take steep slopes out of their density equation, so they are not allowed. So you cannot take credit for that. I think that that's something we need to do, take out those natural resources. The Puget Sound, again, they actually have 1 acre development. You must maintain 65% of that cover and soils as undisturbed. In Prince George's County down in Maryland, they are the parents of low impact development. They put that in place in the early 1990s, and they actually have now a Clean Water Act fee, so that based on your impervious cover, you actually get assessed. So give people incentive. If they go over a particular amount of clearing, they get fined, not fined, but there would be a fee. If they go below that, maybe they can have some incentives and density restriction or benefits. So quick recommendations: stormwater management, volume reduction, require low impact development, take that should out, make it shall. Preserve natural resources, subtract those areas from your density calculations, your wetlands, your water covers. And again, maintain existing vegetation, build to the land, make restrictions on the slopes, the amount of grade alteration that you can have. These can be all implemented and retrofit during redevelopment. We're going to see that a lot over the next decades. People are rebuilding the cottages and putting in the larger homes. So what we need to do is when they redevelop, put in these better measures and really, because these properties are grandfathered by law and they should be. But when they come back in, then let's say, hey, the slate's clean and let's readdress these. So again, why do we do this? And I always got to work in a picture of my daughter, because we do it for clean water and we do it so that we can enjoy our resources in the Adirondack Park. So with that, there's my contact, and thank you very much.